In the winter of 1941, the Eastern Front became one of the most brutal battlefields in human history. Endless forests, frozen rivers, and devastated villages stretched from the outskirts of Moscow to the ruins of Stalingrad. Millions of soldiers fought and died there, in a war so violent that survivors would later claim the land itself became haunted. The armies of Adolf Hitler pushed east in June 1941 during the massive invasion known as Operation Barbarossa. It was the largest military invasion ever launched. More than 3 million German soldiers crossed into the Soviet Union, expecting a quick victory. Instead, they entered a nightmare. The Soviet forces under Joseph Stalin refused to surrender. The war turned into a brutal struggle of survival fought across thousands of kilometers of frozen land. Cities burned. Entire divisions disappeared in the snow. And it was here on this vast battlefield that soldiers began to speak about something strange, something terrifying. They called them the ghost soldiers. The frozen battlefield, the Eastern Front, was unlike any other theater of World War II. Winters could drop to minus 40 degrees Celsius. Bodies often froze where they fell, preserved in the snow like statues. German soldiers wrote in letters home that sometimes the battlefield looked like a frozen graveyard. Dead men stood upright against shattered trees, held in place by ice. At night, when the wind moved through the forest, helmets would shift and frozen uniforms would rustle. Many soldiers swore they saw figures moving among the trees, soldiers who should have been dead. One German infantryman later recalled patrol in early 1942. His unit had been marching through a silent forest near the front line. Suddenly, one of the men shouted. Between the trees stood several Soviet soldiers. They were completely motionless. Their uniforms were covered with snow and ice. The Germans raised their rifles. But when they approached closer, they realized the truth. The soldiers had been dead for weeks, frozen where they had fallen during an earlier battle. Yet from a distance, in the moonlight, they looked alive. The voices and the snow stories like this spread quickly through the trenches. Soldiers on both sides began reporting strange experiences during long winter nights. Some claimed they heard footsteps in the snow when no one was there. Others reported hearing voices whispering in Russian or German, echoing through the forests. A Soviet sniper once wrote in his wartime diary that during a snowstorm he saw figures walking across an open field, dozens of soldiers moving silently through the fog. He aimed his rifle, but before he could fire, the figures vanished. When the storm cleared, the field was empty. Only frozen bodies from an earlier battle remained. The dead of Stalingrad. Perhaps the most chilling stories came from the ruins of Battle of Stalingrad. The battle, fought between 1942 and 1943, was one of the bloodiest in human history. More than 1 million soldiers and civilians died in the shattered city. Entire buildings collapsed with soldiers trapped inside. Months later, when Soviet troops reclaimed the ruins, they discovered bodies everywhere, frozen in basements, buried under rubble, or still sitting behind machine guns. During night patrols, Soviet soldiers claimed they sometimes saw silhouettes moving in the destroyed streets. When they approached, they found nothing but empty ruins and frozen corpses. The wind blowing through broken buildings created strange echoes that sounded like distant voices. Many soldiers believed the spirits of the dead still walked the city. The white-shadowed German troops also told stories about mysterious figures appearing during blizzards. During the brutal winter battles near Moscow in 1941, soldiers sometimes reported seeing white shapes moving through the snowstorms. At first, they believed these were Soviet ski troops, but when they fired their weapons, the shapes vanished into the storm. Later, patrols discovered no footprints in the snow. Some soldiers became convinced that they were seeing the ghosts of fallen comrades wandering across the battlefield. War had exhausted them physically and mentally. Hunger, fear, and constant artillery fire pushed men to the edge of sanity. But the stories continued. The forests of the dead, large parts of the Eastern Front were covered in deep forests. During retreats or sudden offensives, many soldiers died alone in the woods and were never buried. Years later, locals would discover entire groups of skeletons still lying where they had fallen. During the war itself, soldiers marching through these forests sometimes stumbled upon the remains of earlier battles. Helmets half buried in snow, rifles sticking out of frozen ground, uniforms still wrapped around skeletal bodies. At night, these forests became terrifying places. Branches creaked in the wind. Snow fell silently from trees. And many soldiers swore they saw a figure standing between the trunks, watching. Psychological warfare of the battlefield. Modern historians believe many of these stories had a psychological explanation. The Eastern Front was one of the most extreme environments soldiers had ever experienced. Men went weeks without proper sleep. Temperatures destroyed equipment and froze weapons. Hunger and exhaustion were constant. Under such conditions, the human mind can begin to create illusions. Shadows appear to move. Sounds become distorted. Frozen bodies can look alive in moonlight. But for the soldiers who experienced these moments, the fear was real. The endless graves. By the end of World War II, the Eastern Front had claimed more lives than any other battlefield in history. More than 25 million people, soldiers and civilians, died across the Soviet Union. Many of them were never properly buried. Even today, farmers in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus sometimes uncover bones, helmets, and weapons while plowing their fields. War historians call the region the largest battlefield cemetery in the world. For decades after the war, veterans from both sides refused to return to those battlefields. Some said the memories were too painful. Others quietly admitted something else. They felt the land itself was haunted. The legend of the ghost soldiers, whether real or imagined, the stories of the ghost soldiers became part of the folklore of the Eastern Front. They symbolized something deeper than simple ghost stories. They represented the unimaginable scale of death that occurred there. In the frozen forests and ruined cities of the Eastern Front, millions of soldiers fought, suffered, and died far from home. And for those who survived, the memories of those battlefields would remain forever. Because on the Eastern Front, the war did not simply end in 1945. For many soldiers, it never